I call the subcommittee to order. And today we meet to gather diverse opinions and expert analysis on reauthorization of the Beaches Environmental Assessment and Coastal Health Act, or the Beach Act. First signed into law October of 2000, the Beach Act has provided states, local governments, and tribes funding for the assessment, analysis, and public notification programs that monitor our coastal waters. Although each beach and each coastal or Great Lakes shoreline may look pristine, the water quality may be unsafe for human contact. The Beach Act sought to advance three separate goals: making beach water quality monitoring mandatory, making water quality criteria universal, and making sure that the public was well informed on the quality of water that they would be using for swimming, fishing, or other recreational activities. Our country's beaches are far from insignificant. With over 28,500 miles of coastal and Great Lakes shoreline, over 150 million tourists each year seek out a spot on a beach for recreational purposes. In a time when parents bemoan that their children are too focused with computers, video games, and television to get proper outside exercise, beaches provide lush scenery, that is supposed to, and draws people of all ages to the shore for water sports, boating, bird watching, and relaxation. Without monitoring the quality of water, however, our country faces sizable public health concerns. Waterborne pathogens and bacteria can cause illness to all who make contact with the water. Children and the elderly are especially susceptible to the sore throat, severe infections, meningitis, hepatitis, that come from swimming, fishing, or boating in polluted water. Each beach visitor should be informed that the risk could be involved if they choose to immerse themselves in water. By authorizing nearly $62 million in grant funding from 2001 to 2007 to all 35 states with coastal or Great Lakes shoreline, the Beach Act has supported universal criteria for beach monitoring assessments and public notification programs. Although we have made great strides in protecting the public from unsafe waters, the programs have been far from perfect. A GAO report that was released several weeks ago reported that the Environmental Protection Agency has not completed the pathogen or human health studies that were required by the Act, nor has it published a new or revised water quality standards. In addition, the Beach Act grants have not been dispersed by needs as one would think would be the most efficient. Monitoring varies by beach and by state and local officials inform the GAO that they do not have enough funding to address contamination sources. Three of our colleagues have introduced various takes on the reauthorization of the Beach Act this Congress. My colleague from the committee, Congressman Bishop, as well as Congressman Pallone and Congressman Bilbray, each has taken a keen interest in trying to find the most viable solutions to protecting our shore waters. I appreciate your efforts. I welcome the witness panel today and look forward to your testimony. I now ask the gentleman from Louisiana for a statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate your willingness to call this hearing and direct attention to this most important matter. Preservation of recreational assets is extremely important, and the numbers of individuals who press to the coast or to inland river beaches across the country are enormous. Monitoring and taking action to correct or notify individuals of potential hazards is an extraordinarily important activity for this Congress to authorize, and certainly technology enables us to do more in a more cost-efficient manner than ever possible. But clearly there's much work to be done. distribution of the grants on a rational basis is certainly a high priority of this committee's work, and I look forward to hearing from the distinguished panel of witnesses we have scheduled for the afternoon, and certainly from our colleagues who have a keen and direct interest in this matter, who I'm sure will bring their own area of expertise to the subject. And with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing and inviting these distinguished members, local elected officials, and including my good friend from the town of Southampton, the Supervisor Skip Heaney, and members of the environmental community. My district encompasses well over 300 miles of coastline, and I'm very proud to represent some of this country's most beautiful and popular beaches. Maintaining coastal health is an integral objective towards preserving the nation's environment and sustaining the tourist economies of our states. The beach-going public that flocks to our nation's shores this summer reminds us that we deserve pristine waterways to enjoy with our families and the need to preserve them for future generations of Americans. The water quality monitoring and notification grants established in the Beaches Act have been absolutely necessary in protecting the health of beachgoers on our shores. Today, with this discussion, we can continue to assure the American public that preserving healthy shores is a priority of our environmental agenda. In the 109th Congress, with the help of Mr. Pallone and Mr. Lobiondo and others, I introduced legislation to reauthorize the Beach Act for an additional 4 years. This legislation passed through this committee, passed the House, but stalled in the Senate. Earlier this year, I reintroduced similar legislation, H.R. 723, with the help of Mr. Lobiondo, Mr. Bilbray, and several members of this committee, to renew the discussion of how we can continue to protect our nation's beaches. After recent reports marked progress but raised questions about the implementation of the Beach Act, it has become clear that further development of the Beach Act is needed. That is why Mr. Pallone, the author of the original Beach Act, and I decided to pool our resources to advance better legislation to fix problems and fund grant programs. Mr. Pallone will address the committee shortly about how to fund the program for an additional 4 fiscal years and how to solve many of the obstacles and challenges that have become apparent as this program is implemented. Under the Clean Water Act, EPA is tasked with publishing water quality criteria that alerts officials to human health risks, setting a regulatory floor that states must meet. The original Beach Act amended the Clean Water Act to require 35 eligible states to update recreational water quality standards using EPA's 1986 model and authorizing $150 million to do so. The Beach Act also required EPA to develop rapid pathogen tests by 2003 and publish new criteria by 2005, neither of which has been issued by the EPA. In the recent report released by the GAO on the Beach Act, the EPA is criticized for failing to publish water quality criteria for pathogens and failing to meet the 2003 deadline for studies on pathogens and human health. This report makes it obvious that there are problems in need of a solution, and it is most likely not limited to the Great Lakes region, but has national implications, which is why I now support H.R. 2537. I hope my colleagues agree that the Beach Act is an excellent example of an effective government program that benefits communities in every region of the country and has yielded tremendous progress in restoring healthy shores. Madam Chairwoman, with your leadership and support, the Water Resources Subcommittee can ensure that beach visitors throughout the country are assured that local governments have all of the resources they need to monitor recreational waters and alert the public of potential health hazards. To that end, I look forward to working with you, and thank you for your consideration of our request. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Congressman. Congressman Lobiondo.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you very much. Thank you for holding this hearing today. I just have a very brief statement. Over 30 years ago, my home state of New Jersey became one of the first states in the nation to regularly test water quality in its over 300 public beaches and notify the public of disclosure. I'm very proud that New Jersey's program became a model for the nationwide program that we set up under the Beaches Act. Thanks to the Beach Act, New Jersey has recovered over $1.4 million to further strengthen their existing program. The grants are helping to protect the millions of people that visit our 127 miles of coastline every year and our $31 billion tourist industry. I'm disappointed the Senate failed to pass our reauthorization of this critical program in the last Congress, but I look forward to working with you, Madam Chair, and the committee to quickly move legislation to reauthorize and improve the Beach Act. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are pleased to have two very distinguished members for our first panel here this afternoon. First, we have the Honorable Frank Pallone, Jr. of New Jersey's 6th Congressional District, and we have the Honorable Brian Bilbrey of California's 50th Congressional District, who also appeared yesterday. And from the way he described his problem, he'll use every penny authorized if he could get it. We are pleased you were both able to make it this afternoon, and your full statements can be placed in the record. We ask that you try to limit your testimony to 5 minutes oral in a summary. We will continue to proceed in the order in which the witnesses are listed in the call of the hearing, and I'll now recognize Congressman Pallone.
Thank you, Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson. I really appreciate the fact that you're having this hearing today. This is obviously a bill that's very important to us and anyone who lives or works along the coast. And I also want to thank our ranking member Baker as well. And I want to specifically recognize Mr. Bishop from Long Island for his leadership on this issue. Our two offices have worked together in crafting what I believe is the most comprehensive beach protection legislation in our nation's history. Our nation's beaches are vital, not only to residents of our coastal states, but also for countless visitors who come to visit each year. And in New Jersey alone, beaches are the primary driver of a tourism economy that provides nearly 500,000 jobs and generates $36 billion in economic activities for the state each year. And I think the main thing is that we would like Congress to assure beachgoers that our nation's beaches are clean and safe. Now, the 2000 Beach Act, which has already been discussed, thanks to that, we have made major strides over the last 6 years. That act helped us improve water quality testing and monitoring of beaches across the country. The act basically had 3 provisions: requiring states to adopt current EPA water quality criteria to protect beachgoers from getting sick, requiring the EPA to update these water quality criteria with new science and technologies to provide better, faster water testing, and finally, providing grants to states to implement coastal water monitoring programs. My own state of New Jersey used some of this grant money to become the first state to launch a real-time website that notifies beachgoers of the state of our beaches. Now, the bill that's before you today, the Beach Protection Act, is basically an improvement over the 2000 Beaches Act. And that's what Mr. Bishop and I had in mind when we introduced the bill. It would go further to ensure that beachgoers throughout the country can surf, swim, and play on clean and safe beaches. The legislation not only reauthorizes the Beach Act grants to states through 2012, but it also doubles the annual grant levels from $30 million under the old authorization to a new level of $60 million annually. It also expands the scope of those grants from water quality monitoring and notification to also include pollution source tracking and prevention efforts. And most importantly, the legislation goes further on environmental standards than ever before by requiring tougher standards for beach water quality testing and communication. The bill requires that beach water quality violations are disclosed not only to the public, but to all relevant state agencies with beach water pollution authority. Now, I wanted to just stress the rapid testing methods. The new bill mandates the use of rapid testing methods by requiring the EPA to approve the use of testing methods that detect beach bathing water contamination in 2 hours or less. The problem is, in the past, it would take up to 48 hours after the test was done to get the results, and then the beach would be closed 2 days later. But in the meantime, people would be swimming in contaminated waters, and then vice versa. When the testing showed that the beaches could be open again, it would take 2 days before the beaches would be open, even though that they were safe for those 2 days. And from a tourism point of view, obviously that's not good. So we've been advocating for the last several years, I say myself, Mr. Bilbrey, Mr. Bishop, that we use these new standards that basically test that would allow you to get the results in 2 hours or less. I don't have to tell you why that's a good thing. In addition, we're requiring each state receiving the beach grants to implement measures for tracking and identifying sources of beach water pollution, creating a public online database for each beach with relevant pollution and closure information posted, and third, ensuring that closures or advisories are issued shortly after the state finds coastal waters out of compliance with water quality standards or within 24 hours of failed water quality tests. We're also holding states accountable by requiring the EPA administrator to do annual reviews of Granny's compliance with beach access process requirements. Grannies have 1 year to comply with the new environmental standards, or they'll be required to pay at least a 50% match for their grant until they come back into compliance. I just want to say in closing, this is a very important bill. I think it'll make even further strides towards our goal of clean beaches, clean water, swimmable waters, which of course has always been the goal of the Clean Water Act. And once again, I want to thank the chairwoman and the ranking member and of course Mr. Bishop for holding this hearing and for putting this legislation together. And I would also don't want to fail to mention that one of your witnesses is Lisa Jackson, who's our New Jersey Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection. She has been a leader on cleaning up the beaches, cleaning up coastal water quality, and basically protecting our coastal areas. So I also appreciate the fact that you have her as one of your witnesses today. Thank you.
Mr. Pallone, thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Bilbray?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, let's talk about what's really important in this world. So first of all, I'd like to ask you to thank the Madam Chair for holding the hearing today rather than tomorrow. Because you are holding the hearing at this time, I will be able to be in the water surfing in California at noon Pacific Standard Time tomorrow. Some people may think it's recreation. It is a cultural and religious mandate for those of us along the California coastline. Seriously, though, I feel like I've practically ought to pull up a chair here, because we were here earlier this week talking about, Bob Fillner and I, about the problems of international pollution and those relationships. In my neighborhoods where I grew up, for over 50 years, we've had posting of beaches. We have had the testing, and frankly, as a former mayor and county supervisor, and in California, the county supervisors are the ones who supervise the water quality testing and along all the beaches in California. I just sort of took it for granted that everybody did that. Though I am reminded by my wife, who's also, Mr. Baker, a native of New Orleans, that there are places where they don't dare test the water. And the fact is it was just a shock for me when I came here to realize that the rest of the world didn't live up to that standard. Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out, now I think the history of the beach bill, I was privileged to be able to work with Mr. Pallone, Surfrider, and other environmental groups at trying to do this cooperative effort of federal and state agencies and local agencies, that the real success is dependent on the local communities being involved and integrated into this. And I think if you look at where things have not worked out with the beach bill, it has not been on those who are the county supervisors and those who are mayors. It's been that Washington never does quite live up to its expectations. And we've got to remember that if we're going to be successful in the future, it is through the cooperative effort of local communities who have the true vested interest at what happens on their beaches, actually being empowered to do the right thing, and Washington being in a support mode, not necessarily in the direction mode on this. And I really want to point that out very, very strongly. But let me say, on the other flip side is the real-time testing is essential. And as the chairman from New Jersey, the gentleman from New Jersey pointed out, it's actually worse than what some people think. In California, we do not hedge the bet. If there is an incident, if there is rain in California, we post our beaches immediately until the test comes out that it's clean. So what happens is the young people, those of us who are surfers, after a rain, we don't know if it's closed or not. The red signs are up, but we assume that it's probably still clean, that they're just being safe. So a lot of people go into the water with the red signs up because we do not have real-time testing. It takes about 2 to 3 days. So that 2 to 3 days, if the signs are still up 2 or 3 days, then almost you start thinking, well, maybe it's polluted. We need to give credibility to those signs by having real-time testing. I think that is an essential part of this. That is why I have asked that even in my district, that we take a portion of these and actually do these tests and develop these tests to be able to have real-time detection. I think that's an essential part of this issue, so that when a red sign goes up, when the pollution sign goes up, those of us who are water users know that that really means that the test came up positive, not that the test might come up positive in 3 days. And so I think from the public health point of view, we cannot overstate how real-time testing is absolutely essential for the future. And I think that with all the talk of bipartisan support and cooperative efforts, this bill is a good example that it was born and bred of bipartisan cooperation. It grew in the environment of local, state, and federal cooperation. Keep that spirit, keep it moving, and I think we'll be able to make sure that our children are protected and our beaches are clean. So it is a nice thing for me as a legislator to see my son and daughter on the internet, checking out the surf on the internet rather than driving to beaches to look at it, but also on the internet being able to know what the water quality testing has been over a period of time. That the young people are making the internet and this information source part of their daily routine and enjoying our water resources. And I think that is a great legacy that we can leave for the future if we continue to work together, not just here in Washington, but especially with those mayors and those county supervisors and those county and those state officials who are actually going to be our agents in our neighborhoods protecting our environment. And I thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bilbray, thank you very much for your testimony. Mr. Pallone, thank you for your testimony. Our custom is to not ask members to stay for questioning so that you can...
Mr. Chairman, could I deviate from that custom for one moment?
Certainly.
I would just ask Mr. Bilbray, you mentioned that surfing is religion. Do we have a religious symbol here in our presence?
Yes, we do.
I observe that we often get bored in hearings. This is the first time we've gotten a board in a hearing. We appreciate your testimony.
Well, when you hear about in San Diego, we're having board meetings. It's usually out in the waves. We don't sit in there. But it is, we're not going to ask you to bow before our religious symbol as of this time. But thank you very much, and I appreciate the chance to participate.
Thank you both very much. We'll now move to the second panel. Our second panel this afternoon will consist of the Honorable Benjamin Grumbles, the Assistant Administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Water and a frequent visitor to our committee. We will next have the Honorable Lisa Jackson, Commissioner of New Jersey's Department of Environmental Protection. And finally, we will have the Honorable Patrick Schiappini, Supervisor of my hometown of Southampton, New York. For each of you, we will place your full statements in the record, and we ask that you try to limit your verbal testimony to about 5 minutes. And Mr. Grumbles, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As always, it's an honor to appear before the subcommittee. EPA has a lot to be proud of, as do the states and coastal communities, in the progress that has been made since the Beaches Act of 2000, and your committee has a lot to be proud of, too. And I was here, and I remember the pride that the members took in enacting that landmark legislation. And my testimony today on behalf of EPA is to emphasize not just where we've been and what we're currently doing, but also some of the cutting-edge science and the areas where we can continue to make progress and to accelerate the progress in implementing the Beaches Act. And Mr. Chairman, there are three basic areas, the primary focus of our efforts in our Clean Beaches Plan and in implementing with our state partners the Beaches Act. The first is sound science. And there will be a lot of conversation in this hearing about the importance of getting that sound science foundation as we explore rapid methods and identify the best indicators for pathogens so that we can continue to make progress. And the agency is committed to continuing to invest in the sound science to carry out the studies, the epidemiological studies, the other types of scientific analyses to get the methods, the rapid methods, adopted and validated so that we have rapid and reliable reporting. And that leads me to the second principle, the key cornerstone of the Act and of the EPA's efforts, and that is awareness, public notification. The Act authorized grants from EPA to the states for beach water quality monitoring and also public notification. And then the third important component is pollution prevention. And that's where, as we all turn our attention to beach water quality, both in terms of the sound science, the water quality criteria and standards, and also the public awareness and notification, that's where we can also look to the permitting programs, the TMDL planning procedures, look upstream and take important steps to reduce the amount of overflows, the stormwater problems, and plan accordingly. What I'd like to do in the remaining amount of time, Mr. Chairman, is to focus on some key areas. Let's not lose sight of these important accomplishments. Over the last 6 years, we've seen the number of beaches go from 1,000 to over 3,500 that are monitored and assessed under the Beaches Act. That increased monitoring and awareness leads to action. Another major accomplishment based on EPA's actions pursuant to the Beaches Act in December or in late 2004 was that we promulgated for 21 states what we viewed as more protective water quality criteria and standards to help the progress in moving away from the older criteria of fecal coliform to the more important and I think protective of public health criteria involving E. coli and Enterococcus. Another major accomplishment has been to increase public awareness through in this day of information, the information age, and the website. EPA has launched an e-beaches website with other partners, with states. We're all part of this important effort so that the public, whether it's through computers or through other means, gets a much better sense of the quality of the beach water. Another major item I want to focus on, Mr. Chairman, is getting to the next step, and that is completing our critical science research plan. In the next month and a half, we will complete this important plan. It's based in many respects on the unprecedented workshop we had in March, where we had 42 of the nation's experts, including international experts, convene at EPA's request and identify the key scientific issues to move us further, to get to the point where we can, with confidence, use these rapid and reliable methods and the best possible indicators of pathogens. The other major point I want to make is that as we go through this science plan and complete it, we are fully committed to, and we will continue to put a priority on this effort with our research office to complete those studies that will also allow us to issue the criteria that was envisioned by Congress in the Beaches Act, the criteria and standards, so that we can continue to make progress. And then the last point, Mr. Chairman, is that as we focus on the sound science, the public awareness, and the pollution prevention, this is a critically important program to remind all of us, state partners and local officials, of the importance of controlling stormwater, looking upstream to reduce wet weather flows, non-point source pollution, and other forms that ultimately are contributing to the water quality impairments. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity.
Mr. Grumbles, thank you very much for your testimony. We'll now move to Commissioner Jackson. Commissioner Jackson, welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Minority Member Baker. I just want to speak a few minutes. You heard from my Congressman Frank Pallone and Congressman Lo Biondo about the importance of New Jersey's beaches, so I'll quickly reemphasize the fact that our beaches in New Jersey are a statewide, but also, we believe, a national treasure. Besides the economic impact and tourism industry, I think one of the things that I like to talk about is the culture of beaches in New Jersey. Clearly, there's an example of beach culture here, but for most people in New Jersey, we believe part of our heritage is our beaches, are our beaches. And it is true that 30 years ago, our cooperative coastal monitoring program became a model for what is now the original Beach Act, and we're very proud of that. So I'd just like to spend a few minutes letting you know how we implement our monitoring program in the state, because I think there are lessons there for how this act, if implemented, could move forward the country's work with respect to beaches. We have 188 ocean and 76 bay monitoring station, and our CCMP enables local health agencies to respond to immediate public health concerns during our beach seasons. Luckily, the majority of our beach visitors have never seen a beach closed sign. However, local beach managers take them very seriously, not only from the standpoint of notifying the public, which is, of course, their primary purpose, but also because they trigger a series of actions to track down and determine the source of any closure. the majority of our closures are actually associated with one stormwater issue that we are working hard to remedy. It will take a bit more time and certainly some more money, but the state is aware of what happens around the rec pond area. That aside, when we do have closures, we perform sanitary surveys in those beach areas to determine and investigate the source of any water pollution. And the protocols that have been established and followed now for 30 years and improved upon over that time allow us to work closely with local and county governments to make sure that's happening. In addition, we have for many, many decades now used monitoring first by vessels and then later with planes and helicopters to actually fly our coast. We do that cooperatively with EPA. I think they fly one day and we fly the other 6 days or 5 days a week. That allows for some amount of sampling as well as visual observation of algal blooms or other nearshore problems that may cause concern and gives us an early warning system for our beaches. Partial funding for that program has come from our Beach Act grants. We certainly support the legislation sponsored by Congressman Pallone. Our Senator Lautenberg is also supportive of it in New Jersey for a few reasons. You heard about the need for enhanced funding. As much work as we do in New Jersey, and while we appreciate our Beach Act grants, we could and would do more if we had additional funding. And our beaches are important enough to us that we've already made state funding available through the sale of shore license plates, which brings in over $200,000 a year to augment our Beach Act work. We would also improve tracking of pollution sources. I think that that is probably one of the most important parts of the reauthorized Beach Act being proposed. We've been limited because of funding in our ability to do a number of track downs. We have done some successfully applying microbial source tracking techniques such as viral camouflage, antibiotic resistance testing, and the use of optical brighteners at several locations around the state with very, very impressive results, and with results that mean fewer beach closings and fewer incidents around our beaches. We're pleased that the Reauthorized Beach Act would provide funding that would allow us to expand that program greatly. The rapid test methods you've already heard about. We are proud to work this summer with the U.S. EPA in our region to evaluate a rapid method for measuring bacteria in marine waters. And we're planning to use our 2008 Beach Act funds to purchase equipment to allow us to do additional testing of that rapid test method. And timely public notification, although New Jersey prides itself on getting results up within an hour of receipt, obviously the time it takes to receive them is the critical path right now for us. So once again, I'd like to close out by thanking you for the opportunity to appear and testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move to Supervisor Heaney, but it's not often that one gets to introduce one's hometown supervisor to testify before a congressional committee. So if I just may say a word about Supervisor Heaney, he has had over 2 decades of experience as an elected official in the town of Southampton, and he has throughout those 2 decades a strong record as an advocate for protection and preservation of our natural resources. He has been a member of the Southampton Town Board of Trustees, a town councilman, a deputy supervisor, and now for the last 6 years, the supervisor of the town of Southampton. And on this occasion, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Supervisor, for your service to my hometown, and I anxiously await your testimony. Thank you. Your microphone.
I'm happy to be here to represent a typical coastal community that can benefit from the ongoing work of this committee. The town of Southampton is a coastal community of 59,000 residents located approximately 70 miles east of New York City, and it's wedged between the Peconic Bay, which is part of the National Estuary Program, and the New York State designated South Shore Estuary Reserve. These areas provide over 300 miles of shoreline, 19,000 acres of inland tidal areas, and nearly 20 miles of Atlantic Ocean coastline beaches. Here, one finds magnificent scenery, fishing, farmland, boating, dining, parks and hiking, trails, lush wetlands, bays, and creeks. Summer draws hundreds of thousands of visitors from all over the world and contributes millions of dollars to the local economy. Today, thousands of jobs and millions in revenue are derived from maritime industries along our beaches and adjacent waterways. These waterways also support several thousand sport fishermen and commercial fishing fleet at Shinnecock Inlet, the second largest in the state of New York, with over 50 commercial trawlers and longliners operating year-round. Collectively, they produce a dockside value exceeding $16 million per year and roughly $80 million when one factors in economic multipliers. Southampton's beaches are our main recreational destination. Each summer, our population nearly triples, and attendance at public beaches exceeds 370,000 people, generating almost $1 million just from seasonal vehicle passes alone. Beachgoers also put hundreds of millions of dollars into the regional economy through boating, swimming, diving, shopping, sailing, birding, and second home construction. They are also a mainstay for local restaurants, stores, and service industries. In terms of biodiversity, our beaches and estuaries are irreplaceable. They support nearly 200 uncommon species of animals and plants. These species include federally threatened sea turtles, shorebirds, raptors, offshore whales, and rare plants, as well as nearly 150 species of fish and shellfish vital to marine ecology and the economy of our township. Pathogen inputs to the Peconic and the South Shore estuaries present a significant concern because of potential health risks and the economic losses associated with the closure of shellfish beds and public bathing areas. Our bays are critical spawning grounds for scallops, which have sharply declined in numbers due to excessive nutrients, low oxygen levels, contamination of shellfish beds, and recurring brown tide algal blooms. Millions of dollars are being spent by federal, state, and county and local governments, along with Brookhaven National Laboratory and Stony Brook University at Southampton, to support pathogen management and brown tide research. However, additional research and funding is necessary. Tremendous advances have been made to improve water quality and to safeguard beaches by controlling pollution and pathogens from non-point sources such as roadway runoff and boat septic wastes. But much more needs to be done. Our non-point source pollution education began with the passage of the Southampton's own Clean Water Bond Act in 1993, a funding program that continues to capture runoff from roadways that lead to our bays. The town also receives matching funds from the state and the county to enact stormwater abatement projects along literally hundreds of miles of shore-fronting roads. Thanks to federal assistance, Southampton manages a free mobile pump-out program to eliminate boat wastes. We operate 7 boats, 7 days a week, from Memorial Day and between Memorial Day and October 15th each year. And last year, we removed close to 100,000 gallons of septic waste from recreational boats in the Peconic and the South Shore bays. To further combat the loss of tidal wetlands, Southampton also relies on a local community preservation plan that has purchased at least 200 acres of beachfront property. These initiatives also include water quality monitoring, scallop seeding, shellfish population surveys, aquaculture pilot programs, residential and commercial fuel tank removal rebate programs, and restoration of beaches and even eelgrass beds. Since the collapse of the local bay scallop harvest in 1985, some local baymen have resorted to growing finfish and shellfish in cages and racks out in open, clean waters. We urge you to continue to act to protect coastal resources so that we can continue with these important conservation initiatives. Our maritime resources and beaches are crucial to maintaining public health, our economy, and our recreational pursuits. On behalf of the residents of the town of Southampton and neighboring communities, I thank each of you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the need to protect coastal resources.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Heaney. We'll now move to questions. And Mr. Grumbles, if I may start with you. As you know, the EPA missed its deadline for publishing revised water quality criteria, mandated by Congress that that deadline be October of 2005. It's my understanding from your testimony that you're now anticipating reaching that or publishing that criteria, pardon me, by 2012. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Can
Hopefully sooner than that, but
one would hope.
the key is to get the science.
Can you just outline for us briefly why it is that the EPA is so far off the mark? I mean, this isn't a near miss. I mean, from 2005 to 2012 is quite a gap.
I'd be happy to, Mr. Chairman. And the first thing I would say is that this landmark statute, when it was enacted, I think many people recognize that it is the right approach, that deadlines in the statute were ambitious, and that the key principle was to use sound science in order to promulgate criteria and standards that were legally defensible as well as scientifically defensible. So what we have been doing, Mr. Chairman, is we have been gathering the data. It has taken quite a long time in the terms of interviewing 21,000 or more beachgoers, conducting the epidemiological studies, and getting the science right on the indicators, as well as the rapid methods. It is an evolving area. The science is evolving, the molecular and the biological science. There are a lot of complex questions. So, Mr. Chairman, it has taken us time. The key to the statute and the success of its implementation has been in the collaborative nature, working with the states, because they are the ones who are truly in the front lines in terms of implementing the Clean Water Act criteria and standards and the permitting process. So it has been taking some time to do that, and the science has been evolving on the rapid methods. But, Mr. Chairman, EPA is committed to accelerating the pace and to answering some key questions that are arising today about the quantitative polymerase chain reaction and some of the other methods, because we know in this litigious world we've got to get the science right.
The current authorization for the Beach Act is $30 million a year. Current funding is about $10 million. My question is the fact that the EPA has had difficulty meeting this 2005 deadline, now will not meet it till 2012, to what extent, if any, is it related to the fact that you simply don't have enough people to conduct the analysis and issue the findings?
Mr. Chairman,
and if you do not have enough people, to what extent is that related to the fact that funding is, at best case, a third of authorized levels?
well, I think the key to effectively carrying out, to meeting congressional and statutory deadlines, which we always strive to do, is to be able to have a plan under various funding scenarios. The plan that we've been operating under the last several years, one which Congress has also agreed to, and in terms of appropriating about $10 million each year, is based on priorities and on tiering and in using risk and other important risk management methods. I would say that we have the capacity, the current capacity, to meet the expectations. We are running late on two of the 9 areas that were identified in the statute, but I think we have the partners and also the inside expertise, in-house expertise, to meet those deadlines. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, is that the key question as the committee focuses in on reauthorizing this important statute is to keep in mind that the success of it is to stay focused and not to open it up into a much broader program of broad-scale remediation. I think, the agency hasn't taken an official view on the legislation yet, but I think the key is to zero in on the monitoring and the public notification, and then to keep in mind other programs under the Clean Water Act and state programs can help implement the pollution prevention
Let's stay
steps.
on that point for a moment. The 2537 would make, as an allowable use of funds, tracking the sources of coastal water pollution. And did I just hear you say that you believe that we should be narrowing our focus as opposed to expanding our focus? And if I did hear you correctly, what would your reaction be to a statute that would allow for a broader use of funds, such as to track point sources of pollution?
Yeah, I think that the agency and the states and the local officials and stakeholders ought to understand more about the precise intent in terms of what those phrases are in the legislation. What you will find from EPA is support for sanitary surveys, using beach money for sanitary surveys. We take some pride in the fact that we're doing some cutting-edge work on that in the Great Lakes. It's also happening in other places. But, Mr. Chairman, when it comes to the broader, beyond just the sanitary surveys, but the pollution tracking and pollution prevention in a broader context, I think it would be very helpful for us to get more clarity as to what those broad terms are, because I think we run the risk of losing momentum if we open it up to be a much broader statute beyond what it was. But I do think that the value of the beaches statute and the program that EPA is implementing is that once you do put a focus on the science and the monitoring and the public notification, then additional funds and resources and partners will come in the name of pollution prevention and pollution tracking to take steps to reduce the problems so that there won't be as many closures or beach advisories.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Jackson, in your testimony, you've indicated supporting expanding use of funds to allow for source tracking. But under current appropriations, again, about $10 million, and there are 35 states eligible for funding under the Beach Act. That works out to about $300,000 a state. Is tracking feasible under the current funding? And if funding doesn't increase, what impediments does that put on the kind of work you're trying to accomplish?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe under the current grant, track-down work is prohibited. So the track-down work that we currently do, New Jersey gets about $280,000 in Beach Act grant funding. Certainly not enough, but because we pass about 80% of that on to our counties and municipalities who do the work in the field for us. And it's important to get that work out to the front line so that you can manage and move forward, I think, on science as well. But what happens is, and I do think it is a state prerogative, or states are best able to come in when problems are found and look more regionally at a problem. So once we know we have an issue in terms of monitoring data, we like to come in with our staff, and this is where state funds are used to come behind that monitoring data and try to track down sources. If you don't do that work, to me, I think it's an incredibly lost opportunity. It's nice to know what's going on, and I can't imagine why we wouldn't want to take the next step in finding out from a scientific point of view. And we've done this across regions and sometimes mediated a few disputes amongst municipalities about who's causing what problems at whose beach. And the way to solve that is by actually pointing out the problem and making sure it gets fixed. Maybe using some enforcement authority or 319 authority, sometimes some EPA grant money to get it done.
Thank you very much. I just have one more question. Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Baker. And this is for Supervisor Heaney. We know we've been fortunate in Southampton that we have not had beach closures in the recent past. But can you just briefly give us what you would think the implications would be of, let us say, a weekend-long beach closure or even a week-long beach closure at the height of our tourist season?
Well, that would be catastrophic for us and the local economy. We still have essentially a tourist economy that relies heavily on the activity that occurs during the 13 to 14-week period between Memorial Day and Labor Day, although admittedly we are seeing more and more year-round weekenders. But to have a long-term closure of any of our oceanfront beaches along the 19-mile stretch that we have would affect just about every one of the economic sectors that I pointed out earlier in my comments, and have a dramatic impact on local businesses from the bait shop to the nearby bed and breakfast and anyone in between.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baker?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Grumbles, is there now identified or approved a scientifically accepted methodology for real-time pathogen determination?
Real-time meaning not just rapid, but just virtually now, getting the information. I think based on the workshop, expert workshop we had, the answer is no.
What type of time delay would technology now avail us from the standpoint of when the monitoring takes place?
We are very excited about the promising technologies, these molecular methods that involve DNA that, as congressmen and as other witnesses have testified to, can mean getting results in 2 to 3 hours as opposed to 24 or 48 hours. So that is a priority for us, is to validate that and see that that can work and be accepted throughout the country. We still have some substantial questions, though, variability over those emerging technologies or the use of the DNA. And so that is honestly, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, that is a focus, a high priority for us, is getting those rapid methods verified and validated and out into the field throughout the country, not just on a pilot basis.
Is the current best practices scientifically acceptable methodology basically the wet chemistry where you send it to the lab, or is there anything in between the 2 to 3 day wait and real time that it's now deployable?
Well, I think that there are some in-betweens. I would also, Congressman, say that our research office, along with the water office, are teaming up and putting a significant investment into the research precisely to answer the questions you have. And I would also suggest that we can provide much greater detailed answers to your question for the record. But the technologies are promising. We all agree. I think there's consensus that this is where the country needs to be moving. The technologies aren't quite there yet, and the science.
If I may, there is a cost-benefit issue underlying this. Mm-hmm. Right now, if the beaches are closed for 2 days, the local community is uncertain as to water quality. There's 2 days' worth of revenue lost or foregone because of the determination waiting the chemistry process. On the other hand, if we were to have, as close to real time, some sensing device in the water connected to a transponder, which is going to digitally transform the findings to some central location, which may require repeater stations because you can't have a very significant high power off a pole-mounted transponder. Then you're going to have a data collection location which can take those varied sensor readings and put that into something usable for the internet user at home who's trying to find out, can I go to the beach today, in some form or fashion. I don't know quite yet, because the technology is emerging, as to whether or not the cost to the local community, who's going to have to bear the brunt of establishing these real-time reporting mechanisms, is greater than the 2-day cost of the current beach closure using the wet chemistry. And all I'm suggesting is before, and I'm sort of indirectly responding to the first panel, where there was great interest in real-time reporting. I'm for it. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to move cautiously before we mandatorily deploy any new technologies, before we understand what cost that represents to local communities who are going to be the folks actually paying for the reporting methodologies that we're going to dictate by law that they must utilize. Would it be your view that even if new technologies are developed and a community could deploy real-time reporting, that it would still be an option for the community to determine to use the old methodology as long as they continued to close the beach when there was uncertainty?
Congressman, I don't know. I have a concern as well about locking in to requiring EPA to include in the Clean Water Act 304A criteria mandating the use of rapid methods at this point, or including as a condition on EPA grants that Congress appropriates for us to the states that they use rapid methods. And we need to answer some more of the scientific questions, and there needs to be either, certainly in the statute, but also in the EPA regulations, some degree of flexibility, so that as the science continues to evolve and the technologies, that the states and that the local beach managers can actually use the best approach that makes the most sense and actually meets the Clean Water Act's goals.
Well, I come at it just slightly differently. I think if the protection of the beach-using customer is our goal, and the community chooses to use the slower and more costly from a lost revenue perspective, but that's their choice, bathers are prohibited from entering the water, they're secure. If they choose to deploy the more rapid reporting system, which is a convenience to the beach user, however, much more expensive, I would suspect, the beach user is still protected because they're getting the benefit of real-time factual information. But in either event, there's no greater health risk posed to the user of the beach. The beneficiary is the choice to the local community as to which method they would choose to utilize on economic basis. Now, that doesn't step to the front of safety, but it enables you to preserve safety using either route you want. You can buy a new computer, or you can be an old guy and get a slide rule. Doesn't matter to me, as long as you get the answer right. And what I'm saying here is that we get the answer right by protecting the user of the waters until we know for certain what the condition of the water is when they enter it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. We are joined by the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Mr. Oberstar. Mr. Oberstar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Baker, thank you for your participation. It's always good to see you here. Thank you. And Mr. Grumbles, good to see you back here again. It's a familiar place for you. On both sides of the table, actually. You've served this committee in both capacities. And my former colleague, Arlen Stangland, as I recall, you were his administrative assistant for a time. I think we'd all be better off with that. Over in the corner is the portrait of former chairman of this committee, John Blotnick, the father of clean water legislation. My predecessor in Congress, for whom I was administrative assistant for 11 and a half years, and administrator of the committee staff during the time that he was chairman of this committee. When he took the chairmanship of the Subcommittee on Rivers and Harbors, which in fact is the oldest committee of the Congress, established in 1789, and the very first act, this is just a little free history for everybody, the first act, or the first Congress, was that of the Rivers and Harbors Committee to authorize the construction and maintenance of a lighthouse at Hampton Roads. And the second act of the first Congress was to authorize the construction and maintenance of a lighthouse at Cape Henry, all for the purpose of navigation, linking inextricably our committee, its work with the water, transportation, and in subsequent years with the quality of that water. So when John Blotnick assumed the chairmanship of the Subcommittee on Rivers and Harbors, he took a journey down the Mississippi River for the purpose of understanding the navigational needs. But as he traveled along, he saw in the river, which starts just outside of then his district, and then courses through that district, this clean, beautiful water, increasingly polluted. By the time he got to New Orleans, he said there were raw phenols, and he was a microbiologist by training, raw phenols being dumped into the water, bubbling and boiling and killing everything in its wake. He was appalled. He then took a look at the tidal basin. The tidal basin ringed by the cherry trees. And he noted its polluted condition and called it the best-dressed cesspool in America. We have to fix this. And he created the Federal Water Pollution Control Act with the support of garden clubs and Conservation Society and all the fishing and waterfowl hunting groups who wanted to preserve our precious resources of fresh water. About the same, that was 1956, about the same time, my late wife was in college nearby here at Trinity College. One of her classmates went boating on the Potomac and canoeing and fell overboard. The poor child, by the time Joe and I were married, many years later, still had a skin rash from falling into the Potomac, the same river George Washington crossed at one time. We have over 180 million people who are close to the water. In fact, 3/4 of the population of this country lives along the water, either the saltwater coasts or the freshwater or the inland waterways, rivers, and lakes of this country. It's water-based activities are a $50 billion a year sector of our economy. And in 1972, in the Clean Water Act, we established a goal of fishable, swimmable waters by 1985, which, of course, we have not reached. Maybe about 60% of the nation's waters are fishable and swimmable. But the goal remains. And it is astonishing to me that 50 years after the Clean Water Act of 1956, 30-plus years after the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 56, and 30-plus years after the Clean Water Act, that EPA says we really don't know how to establish, with scientific basis, standards for clean water. It's not a defensible position. I heard you say you want more clarity. We have these national research laboratories of EPA. Freshwater, the Environmental Research Laboratory in Duluth for freshwater. And we have the Saltwater Research Laboratory in Rhode Island. We have an additional one at Corvallis, Oregon. We have 5 regional laboratories, 2 national laboratories. Haven't they been useful in establishing standards?
Mr. Chairman, as a student of the Clean Water Act and of your efforts in the Clean Water Act, I would say EPA does know how to establish standards and to identify indicators and methods for rapid reporting and reliable reporting. And we have seen progress, and we have been a very integral part of the progress under the Beaches Act. The great challenge now is to do even better, which we need to do, and that is to move from the 24 or 48-hour methodology that results in tests but over an extended period of time, and to get to the point where a 2-hour or 3-hour test, something much closer to real time, is available and is scientifically and legally defensible. I think we'll get there, Mr. Chairman. And we're doing what we can, and we will get the support of the academic community and other partners as well. But we're at a critical stage. The question isn't whether or not we can set standards or have the technical know-how to establish criteria and standards. It's how do we get to that dramatic improvement for pathogens in coastal, fresh, and marine waters, and move to the DNA-based, molecular-based method. So I just want to clarify that that was the basic message, the point I was getting at. The most important component of the Clean Water Act is the standards, and then coupling that with the enforcement through the permitting program. So.
Right, that's a very thoughtful response. But also remember that standards are not intended, nor were they intended in the 56 Act or the 60 Amendments or 61 Amendments or the Clean Water Act of 72 to be a static item. We know science advances. We know there is greater capability to detect at ever lower, smaller levels harmful amounts of pathogens in the water. We also are faced with the warming of waters for a longer period of time. The warmer the water, the greater the amount of pathogen development and harmful development in that water, whether it's the coastal saltwater resources of the country or the inland waterways. Lake Superior, for example, with which you're very familiar, having served Mr. Stanglin, is about 6 degrees warmer than its all-time temperature. That's very serious. And that means That has also fostered the, and the lower lakes of the Great Lakes also have warmer temperatures, and which have fostered in Lake Erie the development of the viral hemorrhagic septicemia in the sport fishery of Lake Erie. That's now migrating upstream. You know these things, and so you take a snapshot today and say, all right, let's publish this standard. And then as science progresses and you have basis for improving the standards, then you move it. But don't fail to or shrink from establishing a standard because you don't have the very last, best, perfect scientific evidence. I remember John Blotnick, out of frustration at a hearing with a group of scientists sitting there saying, you know, I'm a scientist too. That was my whole training. He said, you can take this test tube and say, yep, it's polluted, and then go back and study it some more. At some point, we have to take action. And that's what legislation is about.
Mr. Chairman, if I had permission, I would love to submit for the record the report that the agency has compiled based on the expert workshop that was held at the end of March. It's on our website.
How many pages is it?
It's about 150, I think, 150 pages. It raises
Is there an
questions.
executive summary of it?
There is an executive summary.
I would ask unanimous consent the executive summary be included in the committee record.
Without objection. So
And the full document received for committee files. I would like to review both.
And it raises questions not for the sake of paralysis by analysis, but the experts throughout the country, and there were also some international experts, is to make sure that we make the most sophisticated and responsible decisions, taking into account tropical and subtropical waters, varying conditions, and just that we move forward smartly, but that we move forward. So I think it's a good resource for the agency, and I appreciate that you including it as part of
Happy
the
to
record.
receive that, and I look forward to reading it myself, and will do so in depth. I'll just conclude by observing that Congressman Bilbray felt so strongly about this beach issue. He worried us to death when he first introduced this bill, and then he felt so strongly about it, he ran for Congress, get reelected to come here and make sure it's carried out. So, with that, thank you very much. I want to thank our two witnesses, Ms. Jackson and Mr. Haney, for being here with us today, and thank you for your contribution.
thank you, Mr. Obstar. Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming and being with us today. And my question is to Mr. Grumbles. Mr. Grumbles, I represent South Carolina, which is Myrtle Beach and Charleston, so it's probably about 175 miles of the coast. And so this is a special item of interest to us, too. And my first question would be, has EPA had the same formula in place for distributing Beach Act dollars since the program's inception, or have you changed your formula?
Congressman, thank you for the question, because it is a subject that we're spending considerable time reviewing and revising. In 2002, we issued guidance, performance criteria guidance, and we also established a formula. So that's the formula that we've been using. Prior to GAO issuing a report, which I believe will come up in this hearing, we convened a state EPA work group to ask amongst our state partners, should the formula be revised? Or we look at beach miles, we look at beach season, we look at beach use. Should we be revising that? And so we are in the midst of digesting the GAO recommendations and also getting further input from our state partners on whether and or how to revise that formula.
And if I might just maybe add some input, I'm just curious if you were taking into account the number of tourists that would be visiting those beaches.
As I understand it, we do look at the one very important component is the use by the public of the beaches, and that's also an important part in terms of the states, how they tier their beaches for monitoring and protection activities. It's based on the risk and also use by the public.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Jackson, if I might ask, one area where my state is facing pressure is the need to expand monitoring in response to additional development and beach use along the coast. Has New Jersey experienced similar challenges, and if so, what have you done to meet those needs?
Thank you. Yes, New Jersey, as the most densely populated state and near a couple of population centers, has seen increasing use, except in those years when we have a beach scare. And those can be extraordinarily expensive and take a long time for us to recover from. We have spent a lot of state money and local money, and we take our Beach Act funding seriously, and we need more of it in order to work on a couple of things. The development of rapid test methods is something we support, and frankly, our citizenship asks for it and is to the point of demanding it. They want us to be cutting edge at the state level and not to wait for a rapid test method. The other thing that we've spent a lot of time, and we've gotten some funding from EPA that we're grateful for, is on timely public notification. We pride ourselves in getting the results of the monitoring we have up within 1 hour. I spoke earlier about the amount of time and resources we spend on source track down. Once we find a problem, the state thinks it's one of our unique roles is to work regionally to find the sources of pollution, because if it's usually a recurring problem, you know, sometimes it's a one-time hit, but oftentimes it's a recurring problem, and we have to work across jurisdictions to bring a solution to the problem so we can be done with it. Thank you.
I thank you very much for your response. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to balance my time.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank our second panel for your testimony and for your response to our questions, and we will now move to our third panel. Thank you very much, all of you.
Okay, thank you.
Our third and final panel for the afternoon will consist of Ms. Nancy Stoner, the Director of the Clean Water Project of the Natural Resources Defense Council, Ms. Maura Diaz, Water Quality Coordinator for the Surfrider Foundation, Dr. Mark Gold, Executive Director of Heal the Bay, and Ms. Anna Mittal, Director of the Natural Resources and Environment Division of the Government Accountability Office. We will accept your full written statements for the record, but we ask that you try to limit your verbal testimony before this panel to about 5 minutes. And Ms. Stoner, we will begin with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify this afternoon, and I appreciate the subcommittee's interest in beach water pollution, and in particular in reauthorizing the Beach Act. Americans love to go to the beach, and we're blessed with thousands of miles of beautiful beaches, many of which we've been hearing about this afternoon. But our beaches are threatened by coastal development, by the pollution generated by people.
There you go.
Thank you. The pollution generated as people move into coastal areas, which Americans are increasingly doing. Development is occurring in the United States at twice the rate of population growth, and it's occurring even faster in coastal areas. And what this generates is sewage pollution, contaminated stormwater pollution, and the loss of wetlands and soil and vegetation that serve as pollution sinks that capture and filter pollution in a natural environment. The result is that we have human and animal waste in the waters. NRDC does a report every year called Testing the Waters on Beach Water Pollution. That report isn't yet available for this year, but last year we found that there were more than 20,000 beach closings and advisories in the U.S. That's not only a threat to the environment and to public health, but to coastal economies as well. So I'm delighted to see the interest of the subcommittee here and of the chairman, Mr. Oberstar, in this issue. In 2000, Congress passed the Beach Act. There were two aspects of it that I wanted to mention: funding state and local monitoring and public notification programs, and requiring EPA to update the public health-based standards for ensuring that beach waters are safe. There's been significant progress in the first component of this. Now, every coastal state has a beach water monitoring and public notification program. There were only a handful of such programs before the Beach Act was passed in 2000. But the more monitoring that's done, the more unhealthy beaches we find. In addition, as we have been discussing, EPA has failed to comply with the mandate to update the public health-based standards. Those standards are more than 20 years old. They're based on even older science, and they fail to protect beachgoers from the full range of waterborne illnesses, and they do not provide adequate protection for children, the elderly, and others who are most susceptible to getting sick from swimming in contaminated beach water. There's three particular things that I would like to address this afternoon, all of which have been mentioned in the hearing already today. The first is, and all of which are in H.R. 2537, the Beach Protection Act, which NRDC strongly endorses and appreciates your leadership in. The first is faster testing. I've heard a lot of indications of support for faster testing, and I believe that it's necessary and appropriate. I support those provisions in the law. It just is unacceptable to have people get information about what the beach water quality was a day or 2 days earlier. They need to know when they swim as close as possible, as close as we can provide that information of whether the water is safe. The rapid tests that are currently being piloted in several states provide that information in 2 hours or less. That information can be, the beaches can be monitored early in the morning and posted by, say, 10 o'clock in the morning when most people arrive at the beach, so people can know whether the beach is safe when they swim, not whether it used to be safe or whether it may be safe in the future. The second thing is increasing funding for prevention as well as monitoring and public notification. This is also in H.R. 2537. I think it's really important. People want to have a safe beach. They want not only to know whether the beach water is safe, but they want to know that it will be safe and that they can go to the beach and enjoy the beach with their families without being afraid of getting sick. In order to do this, we need to identify and address the sources of beach water pollution. I fully understand, and I think the committee fully understands, that there are other sources of funding for sewage and stormwater pollution. As a matter of fact, I had the privilege of testifying before the committee earlier this year on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, which is one of the major sources of pollution. That's not what we're trying to address here. What we're trying to address here is sanitary surveys, source tracking, and the immediate sources of beach water pollution. Is there trash on the beach that's attracting wildlife? Are there other things that can be addressed and immediately correct the sources of beach water pollution to complement the SRF? And the third and last point I wanted to make is improved communication between environmental agencies and public health authorities. A piece of this is in H.R. 2537. Another piece is in another piece of legislation that you've sponsored, Mr. Congressman, H.R. 2452, the Raw Sewage Overflow Community Right to Know Act. These two pieces of legislation work together to ensure that the beach water managers who know when the beach is contaminated are in communication with the environmental agencies who have the responsibility of regulating the sources of beach water pollution. They both need to know when there's a problem so that it can be addressed. I appreciate the opportunity to testify this afternoon. I look forward to working with you as this legislation moves forward.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Our next witness will be Ms. Mara Diaz, who I am proud to say is a graduate of Southampton College, an institution that I served for a long, long time. Ms. Diaz, welcome to the committee. Microphone.
I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak, and Congressman Baker and the rest of the committee members. I as well have brought along a little prop for a history lesson. This is a surfboard that was signed by over 100 members of the House of Representatives, and on the back there's some Senate signatures, which just sort of demonstrates the unanimous support that the Beach Act backed in 2000 and the real need for legislation such as this to keep our beaches clean. Surfrider Foundation is a grassroots environmental nonprofit dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of the world's ocean, waves, and beaches for all people. Surfrider operates through a system of over 60 chapters located in almost every coastal state. Many of our members are in the water daily, so poor water quality is a real concern for us. Surfers have unfortunately begun to take on the role of the canary in the coal mine as the pollution of our beaches becomes more prevalent around this country. Along all of our coasts, surfers and swimmers are noticing flu-like symptoms after being in the water, and they often turn to us when they believe they've become ill from surfing in polluted water. The Beach Act of 2000 is responsible for great improvements in beach monitoring, but unfortunately, inadequate funding has prevented full state implementation and has left the public health at risk in many instances. Many state programs are understaffed and are unable to meet all of their current testing requirements. Blue Water Task Force is Surfrider's water quality monitoring program. Many of the chapter's Blue Water Task Force sampling programs have been designed to fill in the gaps left by the state programs. For instance, beach monitoring is limited to the summertime only in most cold water states. Surfers, however, are in the water year-round, and even swimming is popular well into the warmer fall months. Surfrider members in both Delaware and New Hampshire are working with their state agencies to extend the beach monitoring season beyond summer without adding further financial or staff burden to the states. In Delaware, they've been collecting samples year-round since local surfers got ill after surfing in the fall. Inadequate funding has also resulted in geographical gaps in state programs. In California, some of our volunteers are collecting samples from more of the remote beaches and bringing them to the county health department for analysis to increase their coverage. Because states are forced to prioritize which beaches they will sample, they often choose beaches where they know there are water quality problems, but this leaves the public health at risk at the beaches that are being passed over. Both in Oregon and New Jersey, Surfrider data have been shared with the states to demonstrate new water quality concerns, and as a result, beaches have been added to the state programs that were not previously being sampled. If federal funding were appropriated at the levels recommended by the Beach Protection Act of 2000, I believe many of the gaps and problems with current state implementation could be corrected. Surfrider is also supportive of using Beach Act funds to investigate the sources of pollution. When people see the no swimming signs, their first question is almost invariably, why? We need to be providing the answer to this question so that coastal communities can take action to correct their water quality problems and the signs can be taken down for good. Surfrider also agrees that EPA needs to begin approving new rapid methods. The long lag time can leave swimmers exposed to polluted water, but the opposite is also happening. Many states take a very cautious approach and close beaches preemptively after heavy rain, not knowing whether the water is polluted or not. Then they have to wait to see if it's safe for swimming, leaving the beaches closed when it could have been fine. This happened just this past holiday weekend on Long Island. Heavy rain and thunderstorms on July 4th caused preemptive closures at nearly 70 beaches, and that's just in Suffolk County alone. There are rapid methods available now that the EPA should be considering for approval. A sound, streamlined process to approve these new methods needs to be developed without delay. Relying on old methods is putting the public health at risk and hurting economy. Let me see. The GAO has pointed out before that there are many inconsistencies in implementation of the Beach Act, and this is certainly the case. The EPA should be taking a strong leadership role through the proposed annual reviews to set the bar for state implementation. In particular, we ask that EPA take a close look at how our beaches are being posted. This has been an area of concern for many of our members. At Pismo Beach in California, they were using cardboard signs that were either getting wet or blowing away. This has been corrected since then. Additionally, in Corpus Christi, Texas, the cities refused to post swimming advisories at beaches, even when directed to do so by the state program. This refusal seems to stem from fears that no swimming signs will drive tourists away and hurt the local economy. But Surfrider's been trying to educate the city on how issuing swimming advisories can actually be protective of the tourism industry and will protect the city from certain economic disaster that would occur if tourists became ill and the proper warnings were not in place. In closing, the Surfrider Foundation would like to thank this committee for listening to our perspective of our members who are at the beach and in the water daily. We also urge Congress to consider the real costs of running comprehensive state beach monitoring programs that are in the best interest of public safety, the environmental health of our beaches, and also the vitality of our coastal economies.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gold?
Thank you. My name is Dr. Mark Gold. I'm president of the Santa Monica Environmental Group, Heal the Bay. Thank you for the opportunity and honor to testify on the Beach Act amendment legislation. I've spent over 20 years working on beach water quality issues. As background, I was a co-author of the 1995 Santa Monica Bay epidemiology study on swimmers in runoff contaminated waters. I participated in EPA's expert scientific workshop on critical needs for the development of new or revised recreational water quality criteria, which you've heard already from Mr. Grumbles. I helped author California's beach water quality standards, monitoring and notification law, probably the premier law in the country, and helped create California's Beach Clean Initiative, which has allocated over $100 million to clean up the state's most polluted beaches in about the same time frame as the federal government's only allocated about $62 million. And I helped create Heal the Bay's Beach Report Card, which provides weekly grades for nearly 500 California beaches on an A to F basis, based on fecal bacteria densities. And what you see on the screen is the beach report card, and then the next screen, just to let you know what it is that's just for Santa Monica Bay area, and gives you an idea of we're grading more than 500 beaches on a weekly basis and getting that information out to the public every single Friday afternoon. Heal the Bay strongly supports Representative Pallone's H.R. 2537 because it provides a substantial and necessary funding increase to the program. To date, only $62 million over 7 years has been made available for this program, and the results have been predictable. Far too many heavily visited beaches are not monitored or monitored infrequently and inadequately. Also, in many states, the public is ill-informed about water quality at their favorite beach. A day at the beach should not make you sick, but inadequate monitoring and poor public notification could lead to millions of swimmers unknowingly exposed to unacceptable health risks. In addition, Heal the Bay has the following recommendations for an amendment to the bill. EPA's 2002 monitoring and assessment performance criteria were generic, advisory in nature, and they were only guidance. So please amend the bill as follows. EPA shall develop a baseline beach monitoring and public notification program that shall be used to determine eligibility of states for Beach Act grant funding. The program shall include criteria for which beaches must be monitored based on visitorship, proximity to potential pollution sources, minimum monitoring frequency, sample collection requirements, analytical methods, beach closure requirements for sewage spills, and public notification requirements. If a state does not utilize a program that meets or exceeds this baseline program, then they should not be eligible for Beach Act funds. This amendment is critical to ensure that monitoring results between states and even counties are comparable. For example, currently one cannot compare water quality in Florida, New Jersey, Hawaii, or California because the programs are all so different. Using a metric of number of beach closures or postings to compare counties and states only provides meaningful information if monitoring programs are comparable. Eligibility criteria are commonly used in federal grant programs to ensure high-quality projects, and the same incentive for effective and protective monitoring and public notification programs should occur for Beach Act funding. As you know, the recreational waters criteria development requirement for pathogens and pathogen indicators was not met by EPA. As a nation, we're still relying on criteria based on epidemiology studies completed in the 1970s. Many studies have been completed subsequent to EPA criteria development, and some extraordinary studies are going on as I speak. Please require EPA to look at the results of all pertinent studies completed subsequent to 1985 for criteria development. Also, please require the EPA to protect swimmers in freshwater and marine waters equally, a major shortcoming in the current criteria. And the most sensitive population of swimmers, children, must be protected under the new criteria. Also, if the EPA should choose to eliminate an indicator for criteria use, like E. coli in fresh water, which is something they're thinking about, then the agency must provide scientific substantiation for eliminating the criterion. Finally, criteria development must take into account different sources of pathogens. In the past, the EPA has focused on sewage sources in temperate waters. The new criteria must take into account differences between temperate, subtropical, and tropical waters, and sewage, urban runoff, and non-point source runoff, such as confined animal feedlots, agriculture, and septic systems, sources. All of these recommendations are in the recently released experts report you heard about previously. In conclusion, despite my strong recommendations on improvements necessary to strengthen the Beach Act, I do want to thank EPA for their efforts on the experts workshop and their unbelievable cooperation in providing funding for a health effects study in Avalon and Catalina Island that will start at the end of this month. Congress has a great opportunity to turn a good law into an effective law that will protect the health of hundreds of millions of swimmers every year. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm more than happy to answer any technical questions that you may have, for example, on methods and the like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mittal.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Baker, thank you for inviting us today to participate in your hearing on the Beach Act. Recently, GAO issued a report on the implementation of the Beach Act and the impact that it has had on water quality monitoring at some of our nation's beaches. My testimony will summarize the findings and recommendations that were included in the report and which underscore many of the points that you have already heard today. As you know, to accomplish the goals of the Beach Act, EPA was required to implement 9 specific provisions. We found that EPA has implemented 7 of the 9 provisions, and as a result, all 30 states and 5 territories with coastal recreational beaches now use EPA's water quality criteria for beach monitoring. And the public has better information on the number of beaches being monitored and the extent of contamination at these beaches. However, we also found that EPA has not complied with 2 key requirements of the Act. First, it has not completed the pathogen and human health studies that were to be done by 2003. And second, it has not published the new water quality criteria that were required by 2005. As a result, states continue to use outdated criteria established in 1986 to monitor water quality. Because actions on these 2 provisions are several years behind schedule and may not be completed until 2011 or 2012, we recommended that EPA provide the Congress with a definitive timeline for completing these actions. The Beach Act also authorized EPA to make $30 million annually in grants to eligible states and territories. However, since 2002, the grant program has only been funded at about $10 million a year. A consequence of this lower funding level is that states receive grants that do not reflect their actual monitoring needs. In fact, we found that states with significantly greater monitoring needs, because they have longer coastlines and larger coastal populations, receive almost the same amount of funding as states with significantly smaller coastlines and smaller coastal populations. This relatively flat distribution of grants across the states is due to the combined effect of the lower funding levels and the way that EPA applies the grant distribution formula. We therefore recommended that if funding for the program is not going to increase, then EPA should revise its formula to provide more equitable grants to the states. We also reviewed how some states have used their Beach Act grants and found that these grants have helped increase the number of beaches being monitored as well as the frequency of the monitoring. Because of this increased level of monitoring, states now know which beaches are more likely to be contaminated, which are relatively clean, and which need more resources. However, we also identified a number of inconsistencies in how often the states conduct their beach monitoring, how they take water samples, how they make beach closure or health advisory decisions, and how they notify the public if they find a problem. These inconsistencies could lead to inconsistent levels of public health protection across and among states. To address these concerns, we recommended that EPA develop specific program guidance for the states. Although the Beach Act has helped identify the scope of contamination at coastal beaches, in most cases the underlying causes of this contamination remain unknown and unaddressed. States told us that they do not have the funds to identify what is causing the contamination that they now know exists because of the Beach Act, and they do not have the funds to take actions to mitigate these problems. As you already know, Beach Act funds cannot be used for these purposes. Therefore, we recommended that Congress consider providing some flexibility to the states to allow them to use a part of their Beach Act grant to identify sources of contamination and to take some corrective actions. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, while the Beach Act has helped states improve water quality monitoring, much remains to be done if we are to fully protect U.S. beachgoers. EPA needs to complete the studies and the new water quality criteria that were required by the Act. The program needs to be fully funded, or the grant distribution formula needs to be revised. Inconsistencies in states' monitoring programs and notification programs need to be resolved, and funding is still needed to address sources of contamination. This concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to questions. Ms. Stoner, let me begin with you. It was 1998 when this committee last held hearings on the issue of beach water quality, and at that time there was near unanimity that the water quality criteria standards that were currently in place were inadequate, and it was for that reason that the Beach Act directed the EPA to update these standards before 2005. We now know that we won't be getting an update until 2011 or 2012, which I find shocking, frankly, but that's what we've been told. I understand that the NRDC agrees that these standards are in need of updating and revision. And can you indicate why you feel the current standards are inadequate and what specifically needs to be addressed by any new standards that the EPA may promulgate?
Yes, thank you for that. It enables me one thing to mention that we, of course, brought an action against EPA, NRDC did, about a year ago to ensure that the agency complied with the requirements of the Beach Act, which we think are necessary and appropriate. Dr. Gold mentioned a number of the deficiencies in the standards. One of them is really that they were based on epidemiological studies focusing on sewage-influenced beaches and focusing on gastroenteritis. So they haven't looked at the full range of sources that cause beach water pollution, the largest known source of which is actually contaminated stormwater. And that's one of the very important things that they do in updating the standards. They also haven't looked at all the different kinds of ailments associated with swimming in contaminated beach waters, respiratory illness, earache, pink eye, even very serious ailments, encephalitis, meningitis, and so forth. So we would like the standards that will protect the public from the full range of illnesses and, as was mentioned earlier by several witnesses, provide sufficient protection to ensure that small children and elderly people, pregnant women, others who are most likely to get seriously ill can swim safely at the beach.
Thank you. One other question for you, Ms. Stoner. There's been broad agreement among the panelists this afternoon, with the possible exception of the EPA, that allowing source tracking to be an acceptable use of funds is certainly an appropriate and reasonable thing to do. Beyond that, what other role can the federal government take in helping to support state and local agencies to engage in this pollution source tracking?
Well, I think it is important to increase the authorization and to, of course, appropriate the funds for source tracking, sanitary surveys, and other corrective actions to address the sources of beach water pollution. If there's a stormwater pipe discharging near the beach, if there's a way to have it discharge into a wetland, if there's a bathhouse that is leaking sewage, those kinds of things are very important to do, again, to complement the other sources of funding that Congress provides. Of course, the House has passed the reauthorization of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. I certainly hope the Senate follows suit in that. I'd like to see that fully funded as well. All of those sources of funding to municipal entities, to local utilities are very important in working with communities, assisting communities in addressing the sources of beach water pollution, which of course is the ultimate goal, to have beaches that are clean and safe for everyone.
Thank you. Ms. Diaz. Sounds weird. Beaches are required to develop public notification methods, but there is no uniformity with respect to the methods that they use or the guidelines that would guide their notification. Do you believe that there should be a federal standard that all states should follow? And if so, what are your thoughts on what that standard would be?
I think there needs to be a federal standard both for the notification but also for the decision that's made, because some states close beaches, some states don't close beaches, some states issue advisories, and if there's an advisory posted, someone can still go in the water. So that's another inconsistency. On notification, yeah, I definitely like what's proposed in HR 2537 about decisions should be made within 24 hours. I think that's certainly the least that we could be doing.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Gold, same question to you.
Well, I would just add to that and say the fact that there'd be any discretion whatsoever on a sewage spill. If you have raw sewage getting to the beach, the discretion should be lost for any public health officer. It should just be an automatic closure. It's very, very well known what the health risks are for exposure to raw sewage. And so that would be something that I think would help dramatically. 24 hours, I think, is absolutely critical in that regard. How they do public notification from the standpoint of making sure that there's, a 1-800 hotline, that there's some sort of website information, plus also point of access at the beach. I think those are all critical. I think I would still leave discretionary, believe it or not, on the issue of whether or not you have high bacteria counts and you close or post a beach. Our organization has really taken the tack that that's a public right to know issue as much as anything else, is that if the public wants to take a risk of going in the water and swimming or surfing because the waves are great that day and they're willing to do that, that they shouldn't be kicked out of the water. And as you can imagine, it's pretty difficult to kick people out of the water. But in the event of a raw sewage spill, all bets are off and there should definitely be people removed from the water. There were a couple other questions that were asked earlier that were technical of EPA that I have answers to. I'm not sure if you're interested. Everything from how quickly the methods can provide information, some of the cost information that was being asked before, and I'm not sure if this is a good time or place to do that.
If you could submit those for the record, we would be very grateful.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Ms. Mittal, is that correct?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. The GAO recommended that the EPA establish a definitive timeline for completing the studies that are outstanding on pathogens and their effect on human health. What was the agency's reaction, if any, to that recommendation?
The agency did concur with our recommendation. They said they would develop an action plan and provide a definitive timeline.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems as though before we go to requiring communities to have real-time reporting, Mr. Chairman, we ought to at least get the EPA on real-time reporting. It would seem like a logical first step. Ms. Mittal, in the concluding remarks of your prepared testimony, you made reference to flexibility at the community level to perhaps take action to cure a identified contamination source. As Dr. Gold was talking, if there's clear, convincing evidence, immediate action is necessary, but that doesn't stop the problem. You need resources to go fix it. Can you describe for me a little bit more clearly in the current program what flexibility you have in mind with that recommendation?
Sure. What we heard over and over again from the beach managers we talked to is that the Beach Act grants have allowed them to identify that there is a problem with the water quality. Because they're doing more monitoring, they know there's a reoccurring problem. But the current grants do not allow them to go and use a little bit of that money to find out what is causing the problem. A very few localities actually have their own resources to go and identify what is causing the problem that is leading to the contamination. And so what we recommended was that within certain guidelines, we don't want to divert all of this funding. Monitoring is very important, and the Beach Act has been very successful in establishing these monitoring programs. So we don't want the communities to divert all the monitoring funds to now just going and either identifying sources of problems or remediating. We want them to use within certain guidelines, within a certain amount of money, maybe just a small portion of it, and we thought that EPA could provide the guidelines for when that would be appropriate and use some of their money when they know there's a recurring problem to identify what is causing the problem and then maybe take some limited remediation actions. What we heard from the communities that we talked to is oftentimes the solutions are very simple. They just don't have the resources to identify what is causing the problem and how to fix it.
And that would get to my sort of follow-up question. It would be fairly easy, I would think, to have some sequential triggering steps. For example, it's repetitive, coming from a specific geographic location. Right. The contamination is above a certain unacceptable amount. Yes. And then you could provide out of the funds a basic match for which the locality or state or responsible jurisdiction would have to put up the other money. So they don't get quite as much bang for their buck out of that side. So there is a natural financial incentive to spend it on monitoring, but if it's really bad, you've got to assume localities are acting in good faith.
Right.
They're not going to move that money for a remedy or identifying a remedy unless there's really a high need or justification. I think that sort of premise should run through this whole program. And again, with due respect to the experts about the availability of real-time reporting methodologies and the pilots which may be underway, until we have scientifically valid methodologies where we know we're not going to be having downtime. You know, the worst thing about new technologies is the wet chemistry may be 3 days. If the system goes down, you may be out for quite a while longer. So reliability and scientific validity, I think, must precede broad-based deployment, and in the interim, allow communities to have flexibility to make the choice they believe best for protecting the most number of users in their communities. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't protect people. I'm saying we should use our best and highest judgment in how to deploy very limited resources in the most effective manner possible. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. This brings our hearing to a close. I thank you for your testimony, and thank you for all of your work on this very important effort. Thank you.